The paradox of the stone challenges the idea of an all-powerful being by presenting a problem that seems impossible to resolve. If God is all-powerful, he should be able to create a stone of any size or weight. But if he can create a stone so heavy that even he cannot lift it, then there is something he cannot do. He cannot lift the stone. On the other hand, if he cannot create such a stone, then there is something else he cannot do. He cannot create the unliftable stone. Either way, there appears to be a limit to his power, which contradicts the idea of being all-powerful. This paradox is often used in discussions about omnipotence, a term that describes unlimited power. If a being is truly omnipotent, then nothing should be impossible. However, this scenario suggests a contradiction, which means that either omnipotence is impossible, or the definition of omnipotence needs to be reconsidered. Some argue that the paradox is based on a misunderstanding of what it means to be all-powerful. Others believe it exposes a fundamental flaw in the concept itself. One way to think about the paradox is by breaking it into two options. If God can create the stone but cannot lift it, then he is not all-powerful. If he cannot create the stone at all, then he is also not all-powerful. This creates a logical trap. To escape the trap, some have argued that omnipotence does not mean the ability to do the logically impossible. A logical contradiction, like a square circle or a married bachelor, is not something that even an all-powerful being should be expected to create. In this view, the question itself is flawed because it asks whether an all-powerful being can do something that is self-contradictory. Another response is that omnipotence should be defined differently. Some philosophers have argued that omnipotence means having the ability to do anything that is possible, rather than everything imaginable. Under this definition, creating an unliftable stone would not be a real task, because it contradicts itself. An all-powerful being can lift anything, so asking for something that an all-powerful being cannot lift is the same as asking for something that cannot exist. It is similar to asking if an all-powerful being can create a triangle with 4 sides. The task itself does not make sense, so it is not a limitation of power to say that it cannot be done. Others have tried to resolve the paradox by arguing that omnipotence should include the ability to limit oneself. Under this view, an all-powerful being could create a stone so heavy that he cannot lift it, but only if he chooses to limit his own power. This approach suggests that omnipotence includes the power to impose restrictions on oneself, rather than just raw strength. Some theologians believe this idea is supported by religious teachings. In some traditions, God has chosen to limit his own power in order to give humans free will. If an all-powerful being can choose to limit himself in that way, then it is possible that he could also choose to create a stone too heavy for him to lift, even though he could later choose to remove that limitation. There is also the argument that the paradox misunderstands the relationship between creation and power. The ability to create something does not always mean losing control over it. A human example can help explain this idea. A programmer might design an artificial intelligence that follows specific rules, but that does not mean the programmer is powerless over it. Similarly, creating a heavy stone does not necessarily mean losing the ability to lift it. The paradox assumes that creation and lifting are separate, but an all-powerful being might not be bound by those distinctions. Another interesting approach is to think about the paradox in terms of infinite power. If an all-powerful being has infinite strength, then any stone he creates would also exist within the realm of infinite possibilities. A stone so heavy that even an infinite being could not lift it would also have to be infinite. But in the case of infinite quantities, adding more weight does not create a meaningful difference because infinity does not function like normal numbers. If a being has infinite power, then there is no such thing as too heavy in an absolute sense. This means that the paradox might not apply to a being whose power is human understanding of strength and weight. Some philosophers argue that the paradox highlights the problem of language when discussing divine attributes. Human language is built around finite concepts. Strength, weight, and lifting are all ideas that come from human experience. When these ideas are applied to an infinite being, they may not make sense in the same way. The paradox assumes that God's power operates like human strength, but if God's power is fundamentally different, then the paradox does not work. Another way to approach the problem is through logic itself. The paradox assumes that being all-powerful means being able to do absolutely anything, including contradictory things. But logic itself places restrictions on what is meaningful. If an omnipotent being is bound by logic, then the paradox does not create a real problem. It is simply asking whether a being can do something that cannot logically be done. Some argue that this is no different from asking if an omnipotent being can create a reality where 1 + 1 = 3. The laws of logic do not change, even for an all-powerful being. The paradox has also been used in arguments about the nature of divine power in different religious traditions. Some religious thinkers have accepted the idea that God's power has limits, not because he is weak, but because some things are meaningless. They argue that true omnipotence does not require the ability to perform absurdities. Others believe that divine power includes the ability to act beyond human logic, meaning that the paradox does not apply. There are also those who argue that the paradox is useful in challenging assumptions about power in general. If unlimited power leads to contradictions, then the very idea of unlimited power may need to be re-examined. Some take this as a reason to doubt the existence of an all-powerful being, while others see it as a reason to refine what omnipotence means. The paradox forces people to think carefully about how they define power and whether human logic is enough to capture the nature of an all-powerful being. The paradox has been discussed for centuries and continues to be a popular topic in philosophy, theology, and logic. Some see it as a reason to reject the idea of omnipotence, while others believe it only highlights misunderstandings about power. Regardless of the perspective, the paradox remains a thought-provoking challenge that encourages deeper thinking about the nature of power and what it means to be truly all-powerful. A tolerant society allows people to express different views, beliefs, and lifestyles without fear of persecution. It values freedom of speech and open discussion. But if a society is completely tolerant, it must also tolerate intolerance. This creates a problem. If intolerance grows unchecked, it can destroy the very tolerance that allowed it to exist. This is the paradox of tolerance. A society that wants to remain tolerant may need to reject intolerance, but rejecting intolerance seems like an intolerant act itself. This raises a difficult question. How can a society protect its values without becoming what it opposes? Imagine a town where everyone respects different opinions and ways of life. People have disagreements, but they accept each other's right to live as they choose. Now suppose a new group arrives in the town. They believe that only their way of life is acceptable, and that anyone who disagrees should be silenced or punished. At first, the tolerant people welcome them. They believe in free speech, so they allow the group to express their views. But as time passes, the intolerant group grows in number and influence. They begin demanding that certain books be banned, that specific people be excluded from public life, and that anyone who speaks against them be punished. The town now faces a choice. If it continues to tolerate the intolerant group, the group may gain enough power to change the rules. They could use the freedoms given to them to take those same freedoms away from others. But if the town decides to ban or restrict the group, it goes against its own principle of tolerance. The town would be limiting free speech and suppressing a viewpoint, even if that viewpoint is itself harmful. This is not just a thought experiment. History offers many examples where tolerant societies allowed intolerance to spread, only to be consumed by it. In the early 20th century, democratic countries allowed openly anti-democratic movements to participate in politics. Some of these movements gained enough influence to dismantle democracy from within. This happened because people believed that allowing all views, even those that oppose democracy, was the fairest approach. But once intolerant groups gained power, they eliminated the freedoms that had allowed them to grow. Consider another example. A school encourages open debate. Students can share their opinions freely. But one student starts bullying others, telling them they don't deserve to speak. The school now faces a dilemma. If it allows the student to continue, the other students will stop speaking out of fear. the atmosphere of open discussion will disappear. But if the school punishes the bully, some may argue that it is being intolerant of his views. The same principle applies on a larger scale. If a society allows harmful ideologies to spread unchecked, they can eventually overpower the very system that protected them. The paradox does not mean that every unpopular opinion should be silenced. Disagreements are normal, and societies benefit from debate. But there is a difference between differing opinions and ideologies that seek to destroy the rights of others. A society must decide where to draw the line. It must determine when an idea is simply controversial and when it poses a real threat to tolerance itself. One response to this paradox is that tolerance has limits. A society can be open to different views while refusing to accept those that threaten its core principles. This does not mean silencing every harsh or offensive opinion. It means recognizing when an ideology actively seeks to undermine the freedoms that allow people to coexist peacefully. If a group's goal is to eliminate tolerance, then refusing to tolerate that group is not a contradiction. It is a necessary defense. Some argue that the best way to deal with intolerant ideas is not through suppression, but through debate. They believe that bad ideas should be exposed and challenged rather than banned. In an open society, they argue, truth will defeat falsehood, and justice will overcome hatred. This approach assumes that people will always choose reason over fear and fairness over prejudice. But history shows that this is not always the case. Intolerant movements do not always rely on rational arguments. They often use fear, misinformation, and force to silence opposition. When this happens, simply debating them may not be enough. The paradox of tolerance forces societies to make difficult choices. Ignoring intolerance can allow it to grow strong enough to destroy tolerance itself. But acting against intolerance can seem like a violation of the very freedoms a society wants to protect. The challenge is finding a balance, allowing freedom of thought and speech while preventing movements that would use those freedoms to end freedom for everyone else. This is why laws exist in many countries to prevent speech or actions that incite violence, discrimination, or harm to others. These laws do not exist to suppress unpopular opinions, but to protect the fundamental principles of an open society. The goal is not to eliminate dissent, but to ensure that debate and disagreement remain possible for everyone. Without such protections, a society risks being tolerant only until it is too weak to defend itself. The paradox remains unresolved in a strict logical sense, but in practice, societies make choices about how much intolerance they will allow. These choices shape whether tolerance survives or whether it becomes a tool that enables its own destruction. A prisoner sits before a judge accused of a serious crime. When asked to defend himself, he simply says, "I am innocent. A guilty person would lie, so my statement must be true." At first glance, this reasoning seems to make sense. If guilty people lie and the prisoner claims to be innocent, then he must be telling the truth. But this argument quickly collapses under scrutiny. The central issue is that an innocent person and a guilty person would both claim innocence. No matter what the truth is, the prisoner has every reason to say the same thing. A guilty person does not need to be a liar all the time. They only need to lie when it benefits them. If lying about guilt helps avoid punishment, then both the guilty and the innocent would behave identically. That means the prisoner's reasoning cannot prove anything. To see the flaw more clearly, consider a courtroom where every defendant follows the same logic. Each one states, "I must be innocent because a guilty person would lie." If this reasoning worked, then no one could ever be found guilty. The entire legal system would collapse because the mere assertion of innocence would be enough to dismiss any charge. A person's guilt or innocence must be determined through evidence, not by how they present their case. Imagine a town where two suspects are arrested for a robbery. The first suspect says, "I am innocent because a guilty man would lie." The second suspect, who actually committed the crime, says the same thing. If their argument holds, then both must be innocent. But if both are innocent, then who committed the robbery? The logic contradicts itself because it allows a guilty person to appear just as innocent as a truly innocent one. This paradox exists in many forms beyond the courtroom. In everyday life, people justify their honesty by claiming that dishonest people would behave differently. A student caught cheating might say, "A real cheater would deny it. Since I admit I was just looking at my notes, I must not be a cheater." This argument suggests that a guilty person would act differently, but it ignores the fact that a guilty person could say exactly the same thing to escape blame. A similar issue arises in political debates. A leader accused of corruption might say, "A corrupt politician would try to hide it. Since I am being open about the accusations, I must be innocent." This defense assumes that guilty people always try to cover their tracks, but history shows that guilty individuals often admit small truths to appear more credible. A guilty person can act honest when it serves their interests. Another variation of this paradox appears in trust and relationships. Suppose a person is suspected of lying to their friend. They respond, "I would never lie to you. If I were lying, wouldn't I try harder to convince you?" This argument suggests that liars behave in a predictable way, but the best liars know how to manipulate expectations. A skilled deceiver might pretend to be casual and honest because they know that people expect lies to be obvious. This paradox also affects how people judge credibility. If a scientist presents research, skeptics might say, "A fraudulent scientist would act very confident. Since this scientist is confident, we should be suspicious." But a genuine scientist could also be confident because they believe in their findings. Using behavior alone to determine truth leads to mistakes, because both honest and dishonest people can act the same way. Another problem with this reasoning is that it assumes guilt and lying always go together. This is not always true. A guilty person might tell the truth if they believe honesty will result in a lesser punishment. An innocent person might lie out of fear or confusion. If a defendant falsely believes that a judge will not believe them, they might invent an alibi instead of telling the truth. Now the situation is reversed. An innocent person is lying, and a guilty person might be telling the truth. The connection between guilt and lying is not as strong as the prisoner's argument assumes. The paradox appears in history as well. During witch trials, accused individuals faced a deadly dilemma. If they denied practicing witchcraft, authorities claimed that witches always denied their crimes. If they confessed, they were punished for being witches. No matter what they said, the outcome was the same. This shows the danger of assuming that guilt and lying always go together. If a system is designed to interpret any statement as proof of guilt, then no defense can be effective. Philosophy also struggles with this paradox. It connects to the liar paradox, where a person says, "I am lying." If they are telling the truth, then they must be lying, which contradicts itself. The prisoner's claim follows a similar pattern. He assumes that lying always signals guilt, but this assumption makes it impossible to determine truth, because both guilt and innocence would lead to the same statement. This paradox highlights a deeper issue with logic and reasoning. People often assume that truth and deception follow predictable patterns. They believe that guilty people act nervous or evasive while innocent people speak plainly. But real life does not work that way. Some people lie smoothly, while others stumble over their words, even when they tell the truth. Relying on a single pattern to determine truth creates errors. A related problem is that people sometimes accept weak arguments because they sound reasonable. The prisoner's claim seems logical at first, but it does not hold up to deeper examination. This shows why critical thinking is necessary. Just because a statement appears convincing does not mean it proves anything. People must always ask whether an argument could be used in the same way by both a truthful and a dishonest person. If it can, then it does not provide useful evidence. The paradox also applies in law enforcement. Police interrogations often involve detecting lies. But if an innocent and a guilty person behave the same way, distinguishing between them becomes difficult. Some innocent suspects appear deceptive under stress, while some guilty individuals remain calm. If police assume that lying always signals guilt, they risk making false accusations. Investigations must rely on concrete evidence rather than assumptions about how guilt or innocence should look. This problem extends to artificial intelligence and lie detection. Some technologies claim to detect lies by analyzing speech patterns or facial expressions. But if both liars and honest people can act the same way, then such systems will inevitably make mistakes. They may label nervous truth-tellers as liars or allow skilled deceivers to pass undetected. The underlying assumption that deception has a fixed pattern leads to flawed conclusions. This paradox also connects to political rhetoric. A leader accused of wrongdoing might argue, "If I were guilty, I would be acting guilty. Since I am not, I must be innocent." But guilt is not always reflected in behavior. Some people react to accusations with anger or defiance, while others remain composed. Using demeanor alone to judge innocence can be misleading. Even in personal relationships, this paradox creates problems. Suppose someone accuses a friend of lying. The friend responds, "If I were lying, wouldn't I sound more nervous?" This argument assumes that lies always follow a predictable pattern, but skilled liars know how to appear sincere. Trust must be built on more than just external behavior. The prisoner's self-justification paradox highlights a flaw in reasoning that appears in many areas of life. It reveals that truth cannot always be determined by how someone presents themselves. People often rely on assumptions about lying and guilt, but these assumptions do not always hold. The paradox shows why careful thought and real evidence are necessary when determining guilt, innocence, or honesty. A person in power must make decisions that affect others. When they claim to be neutral, they suggest they have no personal stake in the outcome. But neutrality itself requires judgment, and judgment is influenced by personal views, experiences, and pressures. This creates a conflict. If someone claims neutrality, how can they ensure their decisions are truly unbiased? This is the conflict of interest paradox. It arises in politics, law, business, and even personal relationships. A judge in a courtroom is expected to be neutral. They must apply the law without personal preference. But laws are written by people with different beliefs and interests. Judges interpret laws based on legal precedents, but those precedents were set by other judges who also claimed neutrality. If a judge was once a lawyer representing corporations, can they be truly neutral when ruling on corporate law? They may believe they can separate their past from their present, but their understanding of the law is shaped by their experiences. If they favor corporations in their rulings, they might justify it as a logical interpretation of the law rather than a personal bias. But that justification itself shows how past experiences influence decisions. A journalist covering a political event faces the same problem. They may claim to report only facts, without opinion, but choosing which facts to highlight and which to downplay shapes the audience's perception. If they cover one candidate's scandals, but not another's, they influence public opinion while claiming neutrality. Even the wording of a headline changes meaning. Candidate X accused of fraud suggests guilt more strongly than Candidate X responds to fraud allegations. A journalist may believe they are neutral because they do not endorse a candidate outright, but their choices reveal a perspective. A hiring manager must choose between two candidates for a job. They claim neutrality and say they will base the decision only on qualifications. One candidate attended the same university as the hiring manager. They share a similar background and interests. The other candidate comes from a different part of the country and has a different professional history. The hiring manager may feel more comfortable with the first candidate, interpreting their familiarity as a sign of shared values or competence. They may not recognize this as bias, but their sense of comfort is influencing the decision. If neutrality means ignoring personal preference, is that even possible? A government regulator overseeing an industry must make policy decisions. If they previously worked in that industry, they understand its inner workings. That knowledge makes them qualified, but it also creates a risk. Their past colleagues and friends still work in the industry. If they write regulations that favor businesses over consumers, they may see it as promoting economic growth rather than favoritism. If they write regulations that restrict businesses, they may see it as protecting the public rather than punishing former employers. In both cases, they believe they are neutral, but their background shapes how they define fairness. The paradox appears in international diplomacy. A mediator in a conflict between two nations claims neutrality. They do not favor one side over the other. But neutrality does not mean lack of influence. If they suggest compromises, those compromises reflect their own view of fairness. If they push for peace talks, they assume that peace is the best solution. If one side benefits more from delay, then neutrality in action benefits that side. The mediator may say they are treating both parties equally, but treating unequal sides equally often benefits the stronger party. This paradox challenges the idea of objectivity in decision-making. A teacher grading essays must judge students fairly. But what does fairness mean? If one student writes in a style the teacher prefers, they may receive a higher grade, even if their arguments are weaker. If a teacher believes they are objective, they may not recognize how their personal preferences shape their decisions. A fair grading system tries to set clear standards, but even those standards reflect assumptions. Its conclusions may not apply to older adults or women. The researchers may believe they are neutral because they followed rigorous procedures, but their decision to exclude certain groups shapes the findings. Even in physics, which seems purely objective, researchers must decide what measurements to take and which anomalies to ignore. If a result contradicts a well-established theory, some scientists may dismiss it as an error rather than consider that the theory itself might be wrong. In everyday life, people face this paradox in personal disputes. A friend asked to mediate an argument between two others may try to stay neutral, but listening to one person first already influences how they see the conflict. If they advise compromise, they assume both sides are equally wrong or right. If one person is actually more at fault, neutrality favors them by giving them the same credibility as the other. Even refusing to take a side is a decision that affects the outcome. This paradox does not mean neutrality is impossible. It means that claiming neutrality does not remove bias. Every decision reflects assumptions. Recognizing those assumptions is difficult because they often feel like common sense. A judge who believes they are applying the law fairly may not see how their interpretation favors one side. A journalist who presents both sides of an issue may not see how framing an issue as a debate legitimizes a fringe position. A hiring manager who chooses someone who feels like a good fit may not see how they are reinforcing personal preferences rather than objective qualifications. Attempts to solve this paradox often lead to more complications. Some systems try to remove human judgment entirely. Automated hiring software claims to be neutral by using algorithms. But those algorithms are trained on past hiring decisions, which reflect human biases. If past hiring managers favored one group over another, the software learns to do the same. An AI designed to screen job applicants may reject qualified candidates because they do not match the patterns of previous hires. The attempt to remove bias ends up reinforcing it. Another approach is transparency. Judges disclose conflicts of interest. Journalists reveal political affiliations. Regulators recuse themselves from decisions involving former employers. This helps, but it does not eliminate bias. A judge who acknowledges their past still interprets laws through that lens. A journalist who states their bias may still shape narratives unconsciously. A regulator who steps aside from one decision may still influence policy in ways that reflect their background. Awareness of this paradox matters because it reminds people that neutrality is not the absence of bias, but a decision about how to manage it. A judge who acknowledges their perspective can work harder to counteract it. A journalist who recognizes their framing choices can seek alternative viewpoints. A hiring manager who understands their instinctive preferences can create structured evaluation criteria. Neutrality is not a passive state, but an active effort. The conflict of interest paradox forces people to question what they assume about fairness. It shows that every decision, even those meant to be neutral, carries some influence. It does not mean neutrality is a lie. It means neutrality requires constant self-examination. A judge declares in court, "I will hang you only if I cannot prove you guilty." This statement seems straightforward at first, but it creates an impossible condition. If the judge cannot prove the defendant guilty, then by his own words, he must hang the defendant. But if he hangs the defendant, he is carrying out a punishment that should only be applied when guilt cannot be proven. This contradiction reveals the paradox. To understand why this is a logical trap, Consider a scenario where a person is accused of a crime. The trial begins, and the judge states the unusual rule before reviewing the evidence. The prosecution presents its case, but suppose the evidence is weak or inconclusive. If guilt cannot be established beyond a reasonable doubt, the judge's rule states that the accused must be hanged. However, hanging is a punishment that implies guilt. This means the accused is being punished without proof, which contradicts the idea of a fair trial. Now consider the alternative. If the judge does prove the defendant guilty, then according to his own rule, the hanging should not take place. The condition for punishment is the absence of proof. The moment proof appears, the requirement for execution disappears. The paradox lies in the fact that both outcomes contradict each other. If there is no proof, the judge must punish. But punishment implies guilt, which contradicts the need for proof. If there is proof, then no punishment occurs, making the threat of hanging meaningless. This paradox resembles classic self-referential contradictions. It is similar to the liar paradox, where a statement refers to itself in a way that creates an endless loop. This statement is false, cannot be consistently classified as true or false. The judge's statement does something similar by linking the punishment to the absence of proof. The execution, which should be an action taken based on the judge's decision, undermines the very principle of requiring proof. Imagine the accused raising an objection. Your Honor, you cannot prove me guilty. Since you cannot prove it, you must hang me. But if you hang me, you are treating me as guilty without proof, which contradicts the reason for the hanging. The judge faces a dilemma. He cannot both adhere to his own rule and maintain legal consistency. The structure of justice demands that punishment be based on proven guilt, but the judge's rule sets up a situation where punishment occurs only when proof is absent. The system collapses because it forces the judge into an action that contradicts itself. This paradox highlights deeper issues in logic and justice. Legal systems rely on clear cause and effect reasoning. A crime must be proven for punishment to be justified. If guilt cannot be established, the person is set free. The judge's rule breaks this system by linking the absence of proof to a consequence that should only result from proof. Another way to think about the paradox is to compare it to an ultimatum with conflicting outcomes. Imagine a game where a player can win only if they do not score any points. If the player avoids scoring, they win. But winning implies achieving the goal of the game, which contradicts the rule. If they score, they immediately lose because they did not meet the condition for winning. No matter what the player does, they cannot satisfy the conditions without contradiction. The paradox also has similarities to the well-known problem of Catch-22. In the novel by Joseph Heller, a soldier can avoid dangerous combat missions if he is declared insane. But if he asks to be removed from combat because he fears for his life, he is demonstrating rational thinking, which means he is not insane. Therefore, he must continue flying missions. The soldier's request invalidates itself in the same way that the judge's rule invalidates itself. The moment it is applied, it defeats its own logic. Another related paradox is the unexpected hang. In that scenario, a judge informs a prisoner that they will be hanged on a surprise day next week. The prisoner reasons that if they are not hanged by Thursday night, Friday must be the day. But if Friday is the only remaining option, then it is not a surprise, so it cannot happen then either. By using logical deduction, the prisoner concludes that the hanging will not happen. Yet, when the executioner arrives on an unexpected day, the prisoner is surprised, proving their reasoning wrong. This paradox, like the hanging judge paradox, demonstrates how certain logical conditions can break down when applied to reality. Returning to the judge's dilemma, the only way to resolve the paradox would be to change the rule. If the judge stated instead, "I will hang you if I find you guilty," the contradiction disappears. The punishment follows naturally from the proof. However, by tying the punishment to the absence of proof, the judge creates a scenario where punishment must both exist and not exist at the same time. This paradox exposes the fundamental tension between rules and self-referential conditions. It shows how an authority figure, by trying to establish a rigid principle, can create a scenario where their own actions contradict their stated logic. Justice relies on coherence between rules and their application. The hanging judge paradox demonstrates what happens when a rule undermines itself. Legal systems operate under principles meant to ensure fairness and rational decision-making. The paradoxical rule set by the judge destroys the structure that makes justice possible. It highlights why rules must be carefully constructed to avoid self-defeating contradictions. If a rule makes it impossible to logically apply justice, then it is not a rule at all, but a paradox wrapped in authority. Gödel's incompleteness theorem states that in any sufficiently complex mathematical system, there are true statements that cannot be proven within the system itself. This means that no matter how complete or well-structured a system of rules is, there will always be truths that lie beyond its ability to verify. The theorem challenges the idea that mathematics can be a perfect, self-contained, logical framework. To understand this, consider a simple example. Imagine a machine designed to check mathematical proofs. This machine follows strict logical rules and operates flawlessly within its system. Suppose someone asks it whether a particular statement is true or false. If the machine is powerful enough to check all possible proofs within the system, Gödel's theorem suggests that there will always be some statements that the machine cannot prove either way. These statements are neither provably true nor provably false within the system. A useful analogy is a book that attempts to list all true facts about the world. No matter how complete this book seems, Gödel's theorem implies that there will always be facts that cannot be included because their truth cannot be determined using the book's existing rules. Even if new rules are added, the problem does not go away. New gaps always emerge. Gödel demonstrated his theorem by constructing a statement within arithmetic that essentially says, this statement cannot be proven. If the statement were false, it would mean it could be proven, which contradicts itself. If the statement were true, then it cannot be proven within the system, confirming its truth but proving the system incomplete. This self-referential trick, similar to the liar paradox, forms the foundation of the theorem's logic. Another way to think about it is through a game of chess. Chess follows strict rules, and every legal move follows from those rules. However, there could be scenarios where a position arises that no set of existing rules can fully resolve. A player might ask, is this position a definite win or draw? But no amount of logical reasoning within the game's framework can provide a definitive answer. If new rules are introduced to address this, more unsolvable scenarios could emerge. The implications of this theorem extend far beyond pure mathematics. In computing, it means that no computer program can ever be completely self-sufficient in verifying all truths within its own system. No matter how advanced an artificial intelligence system becomes, there will always be limits to what it can verify. In philosophy, Gödel's theorem challenges the idea that logic alone can form a complete and self-contained foundation for knowledge. Consider a library that tries to contain every possible true statement about the universe. If the library is governed by fixed rules for verifying statements, Gödel's theorem suggests that there will always be truths that fall outside what the library can confirm. Even if the library expands its verification system, new unprovable truths will emerge, keeping the system forever incomplete. Mathematicians once hoped to create a set of rules that could prove all true mathematical statements, a goal known as Hilbert's program. Gödel's theorem shattered this hope by proving that no matter how carefully a system is built, it will always contain true statements that escape proof. This forced mathematicians to rethink the foundations of logic and number theory. One practical effect of this theorem appears in automated theorem proving. A program designed to prove mathematical statements can never be guaranteed to decide every possible question correctly. Some problems will always exist beyond its reach, no matter how sophisticated the system becomes. This has consequences in fields like artificial intelligence, cryptography, and even physics, where mathematical models play a central role. Another illustration of Gödel's theorem is the idea of a self-contained language. Suppose a language has strict rules for defining words. If every word must be defined using other words in the language, there will always be some meanings that cannot be fully captured. If new words are introduced to cover gaps, further gaps appear, making the language incomplete. This mirrors how mathematical systems always leave some truths unprovable. The theorem also suggests limits to human knowledge. If mathematics, the most rigorous logical system, is incomplete, then other systems based on logic and reason may also have fundamental limitations. In science, theories aim to explain the universe, but if the structure of knowledge itself is incomplete, there may always be aspects of reality that remain beyond formal explanation. Hilbert's theorem does not mean that mathematics is broken or useless. Instead, it shows that mathematics is deeper and more intricate than previously believed. Just as a map can never fully capture the real world without losing detail, a mathematical system can never fully capture all mathematical truths without missing something. This paradoxical nature of logic continues to challenge and inspire mathematicians, philosophers, and scientists. A man finds a book on physics in an old library. He studies it, memorizes every detail, and later becomes a renowned physicist. Years later, he travels back in time and gives the same book to his younger self. His younger self reads it, grows up, and eventually hands it to his past self again. The book has no point of origin. It exists in a closed loop, never being created, yet always existing. This is the bootstrap paradox. A musician wakes up one morning with a melody in his head. He writes it down, records it, and releases it as a song. Years later, he time travels to the past and hums it to his younger self, who writes it down, records it, and releases it. The song exists, but no one ever composed it. This contradiction sits at the core of the bootstrap paradox. A scientist discovers blueprints for a machine capable of producing unlimited energy. He builds it, then travels to the past and gives the blueprints to his younger self, who follows them exactly. No one designed the machine. The plans simply exist. This paradox appears in many forms, often involving time travel. The name comes from the phrase pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps, meaning to create something from nothing. In each example, the object or idea has no original creator. It is caught in a loop, passed from the future to the past and back again. The paradox raises deep questions about causality. Normally, things have a clear beginning. A composer writes a song, a scientist invents a machine, a writer creates a book. But in a bootstrap scenario, these things are handed down with no original source. The information, object, or idea exists outside the normal flow of time. Imagine a historian who specializes in medieval literature. One day, a stranger hands her a handwritten manuscript of an unknown Shakespeare play. She verifies its authenticity and publishes it. The play gains worldwide fame. Later in life, she travels back in time and gives the manuscript to Shakespeare himself. Shakespeare copies it and claims it as his own. Centuries later, the historian finds the manuscript again. The play exists, but no one ever wrote it. This paradox is closely related to the grandfather paradox, which deals with the contradictions of changing the past. The grandfather paradox asks what happens if a time traveler prevents their own birth. The bootstrap paradox asks what happens when something has no point of creation. One version of the paradox involves objects rather than ideas. A man finds an old watch in his attic. He later travels to the past and accidentally leaves it behind. A younger version of himself finds it, keeps it, and eventually puts it in the attic, where his older self later finds it again. The watch exists in an endless cycle. It never breaks, wears down, or ages because it never experiences a true beginning. Another version of the paradox involves technology. A time traveler from the future brings back a smartphone and gives it to an inventor in the past. The inventor reverse engineers the device, patents it, and starts a tech revolution. Over time, the same phone model is produced, sold, and eventually given to the time traveler who takes it back to the past. No one originally invented the smartphone. It came from a loop. This paradox challenges our understanding of information. Normally, knowledge is discovered or created, but in a bootstrap scenario, knowledge simply exists. A physicist might receive notes from the future that help them make a breakthrough. They later send those same notes back in time to their younger self. The discovery is real, but it has no point of origin. Many stories use the bootstrap paradox as a plot device. In fiction, time travel creates these loops often. A famous example appears in a television show where a character receives a mysterious book of facts. He memorizes it and later travels back in time to publish it under his own name. The book's knowledge is accurate, but no one originally wrote it. A more practical version of the paradox appears in cultural evolution. Consider a folk song passed down through generations. Over time, the original composer's name is lost. Later, a historian finds an old recording and claims it as an ancient song. But what if that historian later travels back in time and teaches the song to the original musician? The song has no real origin. The paradox also applies to language. Suppose a new word appears in a dictionary with an unknown first use. A linguist travels back in time and introduces the word before it was officially recorded. The word becomes common, appearing in future dictionaries. Where did it come from? These scenarios break the usual rules of cause and effect. Normally, events follow a logical sequence. A scientist develops a theory, writes a paper, and others build on it. In a bootstrap scenario, the paper already exists, and the scientist simply reintroduces it into the timeline. This paradox highlights the instability of time travel. If time loops exist, then objects, ideas, and knowledge could circulate indefinitely. This creates logical inconsistencies. An object could exist forever without ever being made. A person could learn something without anyone discovering it. The paradox also has implications for artificial intelligence. Imagine an AI programmed to improve itself. It generates an advanced version of itself, which then sends its source code back in time. The earlier version simply copies the future code. The AI becomes more powerful without anyone ever designing the improved version. This paradox raises a fundamental question: does existence require an origin? In our normal understanding of reality, everything has a cause. A book has an author, a song has a composer, an invention has an inventor. The bootstrap paradox challenges this assumption by creating situations where things exist without ever being created. Some scientists speculate that if time travel were possible, bootstrap loops might exist. In theoretical physics, certain interpretations of time travel allow information to be passed backward without contradictions. If true, this would mean that knowledge or technology could exist in stable time loops. Some argue that the paradox is an illusion. They claim that just because an event happens in a loop does not mean it lacks an origin. Instead, they suggest that the loop itself serves as the origin. This view, however, does not fully resolve the problem. It simply shifts the question from "who created this?" to "does something need to be created at all?" The paradox continues to challenge philosophers and scientists. It forces people to rethink assumptions about time, causality, and information. If something can exist without an origin, then our understanding of creation itself may be incomplete. Meno's paradox raises a difficult question about knowledge and learning. It suggests that if you already know what you are looking for, then searching for it is unnecessary. But if you do not know what you are looking for, then how would you recognize it when you find it? This problem challenges the idea of discovery and forces people to think about how learning actually works. Imagine someone searching for a lost object. If they know exactly what they lost, they can focus on finding it. They might remember the last place they saw it, retrace their steps, or search in likely locations. But if they do not know what they lost, how would they know when they have found it? They could pick up random objects and examine them, but without a reference point, they would have no way to confirm whether they had found the missing item. The paradox highlights this issue in a broader sense. If knowledge is like a lost object, then learning seems impossible because a person must already know something in order to recognize it. Plato introduced this paradox through a conversation between Socrates and Meno. Meno asks how people can search for knowledge if they do not already know what they are looking for. Socrates responds by suggesting that knowledge is not something newly discovered, but something remembered. He introduces the idea of recollection, arguing that the soul already contains knowledge, and that learning is simply a process of recalling what was forgotten. This explanation shifts the problem from discovery to memory, but it does not eliminate the paradox itself. Think about how a scientist searches for a new element. If the scientist has no idea what the element looks like or what properties it has, then how do they know what to test? If they already knew what to expect, then it would not be a discovery. Science moves forward by making hypotheses, testing them, and refining them. But the paradox raises the question of how the first hypothesis is formed. If a scientist has absolutely no prior knowledge, how do they make any progress at all? A similar issue appears in language learning. A child learns words by associating them with objects. But how does the process begin? If a child does not yet know the meaning of a word, how do they learn it without already having some understanding of what it refers to? If someone points to an apple and says apple, the child might connect the sound to the object. But what if they misunderstand and think apple means red or round instead? Learning depends on context, but the paradox suggests that some prior knowledge is necessary to recognize new information correctly. The paradox also appears in personal growth. Imagine someone searching for happiness. If they already know what will make them happy, then they can go after it directly. But if they are unsure what happiness is for them, how do they find it? They might try different things, but without a way to recognize happiness when they feel it, they could continue searching indefinitely. Some people spend their lives chasing success, love, or fulfillment, only to realize later that they did not know what they were looking for in the first place. In everyday life, people face the paradox when making decisions. If someone is trying to choose a career, they might research different jobs and compare them. But if they do not know what kind of work they would enjoy, how do they decide? They can gather information, but at some point, they have to take a chance without knowing for certain if their choice is correct. The paradox suggests that a person must have some prior understanding of what they seek before they can successfully search for it. The issue becomes even more complicated in philosophy. If philosophers are searching for truth, how do they recognize it when they find it? If truth is completely unknown, then anything could be true. But if philosophers already have a sense of what truth looks like, then they are not really discovering it. They are confirming something they already believed. This creates a tension between exploration and expectation. A person must be open to new ideas, but they also need a way to determine whether those ideas are valid. Some people solve the paradox by arguing that knowledge is built step by step. Even if a person does not know exactly what they are looking for, they can move forward by refining their understanding. A detective solving a mystery may not know who the criminal is, but they can gather clues, eliminate possibilities, and gradually form a clearer picture. This process allows learning to happen even when the final answer is unknown. Others argue that the paradox proves that knowledge is impossible without some form of intuition. If people needed complete knowledge before they could begin learning, then no one could ever learn anything. Instead, they rely on instincts, guesses, and patterns to guide them. A baby learning to walk does not understand balance, physics, or muscle control, but they still take steps, fall, and improve. This suggests that learning does not require full knowledge in advance, but can happen through experience and correction. In creative fields, the paradox takes another form. An artist trying to create something new must have an idea before they start, but they often do not know exactly what the final work will look like. If they already had the complete image in their mind, then making the art would just be copying an existing vision. But if they have no idea at all, then where do they start? Many artists solve this by beginning with rough sketches, experimenting, and allowing the work to evolve. The same applies to writing, music, and invention. Creativity often works by balancing knowledge with uncertainty. The paradox also influences artificial intelligence. A machine learning algorithm improves by recognizing patterns in data. But if it has no starting point, how does it begin learning? If an AI has never seen a cat before, how does it learn what a cat looks like? It needs some labeled examples to begin with, which means that its learning is not from pure discovery, but from refining existing knowledge. The paradox suggests that true artificial intelligence would need some built-in way of recognizing new information before it can learn anything meaningful. A similar problem arises in history. If historians are searching for the truth about past events, how do they know when they have found it? Historical records are incomplete, biased, or lost over time. If a historian already knows what they are looking for, then they might unconsciously interpret evidence to fit their expectations. But if they have no idea what the truth is, how do they avoid being misled by false information? This creates a challenge in distinguishing between discovering history and constructing a narrative based on assumptions. Meno's paradox appears whenever people search for meaning, whether in science, philosophy, or daily life. It questions how learning works and whether true discovery is even possible. If a person already knows what they are looking for, then they do not need to search. If they do not know, then they have no way to recognize it when they find it. This paradox forces people to think about how they define knowledge and what it means to learn something new. If someone says that nothing is true, they create an immediate contradiction. The statement itself must either be true or false. If it is true, then at least one thing is true, the statement itself. That contradicts the idea that nothing is true. If the statement is false, then something must be true, which again disproves the original claim. This paradox forces a person into a logical loop that they cannot escape. A person who claims that nothing is true takes a radical position on knowledge and reality. They deny all facts, beliefs, and truths. But this stance collapses under its own weight. To deny all truths, they must accept at least one truth, the truth of their denial. If they argue that even their own statement is not true, then it holds no meaning. It becomes self-defeating. Imagine a conversation between two people. One believes that some things are true, while the other insists that nothing is true. The first person asks, "Is that statement true?" The second person hesitates. If they answer yes, then they admit that at least one thing is true. If they answer no, then their own belief falls apart. They cannot defend their position without contradicting themselves. This paradox applies to more than just abstract philosophy. Consider a courtroom where a witness claims that all testimony is unreliable. If that were true, then their own testimony would also be unreliable. A judge or jury would have no reason to believe them. The same problem arises in history. If a historian argues that no historical accounts are accurate, then their own analysis must also be inaccurate. If everything is false, then there is no reason to trust any argument at all. Skepticism plays a major role in philosophy, but extreme skepticism creates problems. A person might argue that we cannot know anything with absolute certainty. This is a reasonable position, but if they push further and say that absolutely nothing is true, they contradict themselves. They must accept at least one truth, the truth of their own claim. Philosophers throughout history have debated the limits of skepticism. Some, like Descartes, tried to find a foundation that was impossible to doubt. Others, like Nietzsche, explored the consequences of rejecting absolute truth. The paradox also appears in everyday situations. Imagine a news report that claims all media is untrustworthy. If that is true, then the report itself must be untrustworthy. If it is false, then some media must be trustworthy. Either way, the original claim collapses. This happens in political debates as well. A politician might say that all government officials are corrupt. But if they are a government official themselves, then they must also be corrupt. If they are telling the truth, then at least one official is honest, which contradicts their statement. Language itself plays a role in this paradox. When a person says nothing is true, they use language to communicate meaning. But meaning depends on some level of truth. Words refer to concepts, and concepts exist within a shared understanding of reality. If nothing were true, then communication would break down. People could say anything, and none of it would have meaning. Even a simple sentence like, "The sky is blue," would be meaningless if no truths existed. The paradox also appears in mathematics. If someone claims that no mathematical statements are true, then they must apply that to their own claim. But mathematics relies on logical consistency. If nothing in mathematics were true, then numbers, equations, and calculations would all collapse. Yet people rely on math every day. They trust their bank accounts, follow measurements, and expect technology to function correctly. These all depend on mathematical truths. Science faces a similar issue. A person might argue that no scientific facts are true, but science builds knowledge through observation and testing. If every scientific claim were false, then the world would not function the way it does. Planes would not fly, medicine would not work, and basic technology would fail. The idea that nothing is true contradicts the reality of daily life. People might distrust specific scientific theories, but they still rely on scientific truths in practice. Morality also struggles with this paradox. If someone claims that no moral principles are true, then they must apply that to their own belief. If no morality is true, then the idea that no morality is true has no moral weight, cannot be better or worse than any other claim. Yet, people who reject moral truth often still hold strong opinions about right and wrong. They might say that justice, fairness, or freedom matter, but if nothing is true, then those values have no foundation. The paradox extends into personal identity. If a person claims that no identities are real, then their own identity must also be unreal. But people live as individuals with thoughts, feelings, and experiences. If identity were entirely false, then no one could make meaningful choices. A person who claims that nothing is true still eats, sleeps, and interacts with the world. Their actions suggest that they believe in some basic truths, even if they deny them in words. Even in logic itself, this paradox causes problems. Logical systems rely on basic principles, such as the law of non-contradiction. This law states that something cannot be both true and false at the same time. If nothing is true, then this law must also be false. But if it is false, then contradictions become possible. A world where contradictions exist freely would not function. It would mean that something could exist and not exist at the same time. Reality does not work that way. The paradox of nihilism highlights a fundamental issue in thinking. If a belief destroys itself upon examination, it cannot be a stable belief. The claim that nothing is true forces a person into an impossible position. They must either admit that at least one thing is true or accept that their own statement is meaningless. This makes it impossible to fully embrace the idea without contradiction. Some thinkers try to escape this paradox by redefining truth. Instead of absolute truth, they talk about relative truth. They argue that what is true depends on perspective or context. This approach avoids the paradox but introduces new problems. If truth is entirely relative, then one person's truth could contradict another's. But if both truths are valid, then contradiction itself must be acceptable. This creates another logical conflict. Other thinkers argue that truth depends on function. They suggest that statements are true if they work in practice. This is similar to pragmatism, a philosophical approach that values usefulness over abstract truth. In this view, saying nothing is true is pointless because it does not help people navigate the world. Truth is what allows people to predict and interact with reality. The paradox of nihilism also raises questions about belief. If a person believes that nothing is true, why do they hold that belief? If beliefs have no truth, then their own belief is as meaningless as any other. Yet, people who claim that nothing is true often argue passionately about their perspective. This suggests that, at some level, they still rely on the idea of truth. In debates, this paradox serves as a test for logical consistency. If someone denies all truth, they must explain how their own denial escapes the paradox. Most attempts to avoid the contradiction either redefine truth or shift the argument to another level. But no escape fully resolves the problem. Any position that denies all truth still depends on at least one truth to make sense. The paradox also appears in artificial intelligence and computing. Computers operate on logical rules. If no truths exist, then no logical system can function. Programs would not execute, algorithms would fail, and data would lose meaning. The very structure of computing relies on the assumption that certain statements are true. Without that foundation, modern technology would not work. In the end, the paradox of nihilism reveals a deep contradiction in extreme skepticism. To say that nothing is true, a person must assume at least one truth. But if even one truth exists, then the idea that nothing is true falls apart. This paradox forces people to recognize that truth, in some form, must exist. The drinker paradox is a statement in logic that seems absurd at first but follows from simple reasoning. It claims that in any non-empty pub, there is at least one person such that if they are drinking, then everyone in the pub is drinking. This seems impossible because it suggests that a single person's drinking behavior dictates the behavior of the entire pub. However, when broken down logically, the statement is always true regardless of how many people are in the pub or who is drinking. Imagine walking into a pub with 10 people. Some might have drinks, while others might not. The paradox does not claim that everyone is drinking, only that there exists at least one person with this peculiar property. The logical trick comes from the way the statement is structured. The key phrase is, if they are drinking, then everyone is drinking. This is a conditional statement. In logic, a conditional statement is true unless the first part is true and the second part is false. That means the only way this statement could be false is if someone is drinking while someone else is not. Now consider the simplest case. Suppose only one person is in the pub. If they are drinking, then everyone in the pub, which is just them, is drinking. If they are not drinking, the statement is still true because the condition never occurs. The paradox does not require the person to be drinking. It only states that if they were, then everyone would be. With two people, the reasoning remains the same. Suppose one of them is drinking. If that person is the special one from the paradox, then the statement holds. If they are not the special one, then the other person is. If the other person is not drinking, the statement still holds because the condition is never triggered. If the second person is drinking, then both are drinking, so the statement remains true. No matter how many people are in the pub, this reasoning scales up. To see why this paradox works, consider a mathematical approach. In formal logic, this follows from the principle that any non-empty set has at least one element that satisfies a universal property. The logic does not depend on actual behavior, only on the structure of the statement itself. The paradox plays on the fact that a conditional statement is automatically true when the first part of the condition is false. If someone in the pub is not drinking, the statement does not require anything to happen. Think of a different example with the same logical form. Consider a classroom where at least one student exists. The statement might say, there is a student such that if they fail the test, then everyone in the class fails the test. If no one fails, the condition is never met, so the statement holds. If someone does fail, the special person fulfilling the paradox could be them. The paradox does not require failure. It just states that if failure happens for that one person, then it happens for everyone. This structure is similar to how logical proofs work. The paradox is a result of mathematical logic rather than actual drinking behavior. It does not say everyone must drink, only that some person has the property that if they were drinking, then all would be. It is an example of how formal logic can lead to statements that sound absurd but are still technically correct. The same reasoning appears in other areas of logic. In set theory, a similar argument shows that every non-empty set has a least element under certain conditions. In probability, this logic can help with statements about expected values and outcomes. Even in everyday reasoning, people use similar logic without realizing it. To make sense of this paradox, it helps to consider how conditional statements work. A simple example is the sentence, "If it rains tomorrow, then I will bring an umbrella." If it does not rain, the statement is still true because the condition never happened. This is the same logic that makes the drinker paradox work. The key is that a conditional statement is only false when the first part is true and the second part is false. Otherwise, it is always considered true. People often struggle with this because everyday language does not follow strict logic. In normal speech, if someone said, "There is a person in the room such that if they leave, then everyone leaves," it would seem strange. But in logic, this is a completely valid structure. The difficulty comes from how people interpret if-then statements in conversation versus how they work in formal reasoning. Another way to break this down is to think about how statements apply to groups. Suppose you are in a team where the rule is, if one person works overtime, then everyone must work overtime. If no one works overtime, the rule is still technically true because the condition was never met. If one person does work overtime, then everyone must, fulfilling the statement. The same principle applies in the pub example. The paradox also challenges intuition about causality. When people hear it, they assume it suggests that one person's drinking somehow forces everyone else to drink. This is not the case. The paradox does not describe cause and effect, only logical truth. It does not say drinking spreads through the pub. It only identifies that at least one person in the pub satisfies a particular statement structure. This is similar to the way mathematical truths can seem counterintuitive. Consider the statement, "There exists a number such that if it is greater than 5, then all numbers are greater than 5. This is true because if the number is never greater than 5, the condition never activates. If the number is greater than 5, then the statement is still correct within that specific situation. The paradox also reveals a common mistake in reasoning. People assume that a statement must have a direct, observable consequence to be meaningful. But logical truths do not require real-world effects. Many paradoxes rely on this misunderstanding. The statement is logically valid, even though it seems strange when applied to a real pub. A similar example can be found in game theory. Imagine a situation where a company states, if one person in this meeting agrees to the proposal, then everyone agrees. If no one agrees, the condition never happens, so the statement holds. If someone does agree, then the agreement spreads, fulfilling the condition. This structure repeats in many logical paradoxes. The drinker paradox forces a re-evaluation of how conditional statements work. It highlights how formal logic often leads to conclusions that contradict intuition. The paradox does not require an actual mechanism for spreading drinking behavior. It only relies on the structure of the statement. Whether applied to a pub, a classroom, or a business setting, the logical foundation remains unchanged. A single vote rarely changes the outcome of an election. If a person chooses not to vote, the election still happens, and the result remains nearly the same. This reasoning applies to every voter. If one vote doesn't make a difference, then it seems logical that 10 votes don't either. If 10 votes don't, then 100 don't. If 100 don't, then million don't. By this logic, voting itself appears useless. Imagine a national election where 100 million people vote. A single voter looks at the numbers and realizes that even if they show up or stay home, the result will almost certainly be the same. This thought process repeats for thousands of people who, believing their vote doesn't matter, decide not to vote. If enough people follow this reasoning, voter turnout drops significantly. An election that should have represented the majority instead reflects the will of a much smaller group. This problem resembles the Sarid's paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap. If a single grain of sand is not a heap, and adding one grain doesn't create a heap, then at what point does a heap exist? The same applies to voting. If one vote doesn't decide an election, and adding one vote at a time never seems to make a difference, then when does voting start to matter? This paradox challenges the logic behind individual participation in collective decision-making. A voter may look at historical data and see that elections are rarely decided by one vote. They might conclude that their participation is statistically meaningless. In a large democracy, elections usually have thousands or millions of votes between the winner and the loser. Even in close elections, a single ballot has never been the sole deciding factor. If a voter adopts this mindset, they may see voting as an irrational act. They may choose to stay home, believing their absence has no impact. But when many people think this way, it creates the conditions for the very outcome they dismissed as unlikely. Consider a local election with 10,000 voters. A candidate is ahead by 5 votes. If one person had voted differently, the result would not have changed. But what if 6 people thought their votes didn't matter and stayed home? Suddenly, the election swings in the other direction. Each individual still rationalized that their vote was insignificant, yet the collective impact of their choices changed the result. This paradox exposes the flaw in assuming that individual actions do not contribute to large-scale outcomes. The paradox also applies to collective action beyond elections. If one person recycles, it doesn't save the planet. If one person avoids driving to reduce carbon emissions, the climate remains unchanged. If one person refuses to pay taxes, the government still collects revenue. But if too many people follow this logic, systems break down. In every case, the importance of an individual act depends on whether enough others do the same. Psychology plays a role in how people respond to this paradox. When elections feel inevitable, voter turnout drops. If the media portrays one candidate as certain to win, people assume their vote won't change the outcome. This assumption affects not just individual choices, but also entire demographics. If young voters believe their generation's turnout is low, they may feel even less motivated to participate. If a party's supporters assume they will win comfortably, they may skip voting, which can create unexpected upsets. Strategists understand this paradox and use it to influence elections. Campaigns focus on voter mobilization because they know that perception affects behavior. A party leading in polls may downplay their advantage to prevent complacency among their voters. A party trailing may highlight the importance of every vote to create urgency. The paradox makes elections unpredictable because large numbers of people base their decisions on what they believe others will do. History provides examples of elections decided by very few votes. The 2000 U.S. presidential election came down to 537 votes in Florida. If a small fraction of voters had made a different choice, the presidency would have changed hands. From an individual perspective, no single voter decided the election, but from a broader perspective, small shifts in participation had massive consequences. In state and local elections, margins can be even smaller. Some races have been decided by fewer than 10 votes, making turnout critical. A rational voter might still argue that the odds of their ballot being the deciding factor are so low that it doesn't justify the effort. Voting takes time. People must register, find polling places, and wait in line. The probability of a single vote changing a national election is close to zero. But elections are not just about mathematical probability. They are about participation in a system that depends on widespread engagement. The act of voting sends a signal, even if an individual vote doesn't determine the outcome. The paradox also intersects with issues of fairness. If everyone followed the logic that their vote doesn't matter, democracy would fail. The institutions designed to reflect public will would instead reflect only the choices of a small percentage of the population. This creates an imbalance where the most engaged voters, often those with the most extreme views, determine outcomes. Moderate or disengaged voters, believing their participation is meaningless, allow others to shape policies that affect everyone. Some argue that this paradox is less of a logical flaw and more of a misunderstanding of probability and collective action. A single vote matters in the way that a single drop of water matters in a flood. One drop does not cause the flood, but without many drops, there is no flood at all. The paradox challenges people to think about cause and effect on a larger scale. While a single vote may not be decisive, the cumulative effect of many similar decisions creates real impact. Attempts to address this paradox include compulsory voting laws, public campaigns to encourage participation, and efforts to make voting easier. Some countries require citizens to vote, treating it as a civic duty, like paying taxes or serving on a jury. Others rely on education and social pressure to emphasize the importance of participation. The paradox remains unresolved because it is based on individual logic conflicting with collective needs. A rational person may still conclude their vote doesn't matter, but if too many people reach this conclusion, democracy itself is weakened. People often resolve the paradox through a sense of duty rather than strict logic. They vote not because they expect to be the deciding factor, but because they believe in participation. Some vote to honor past struggles for voting rights. Others vote to express their values, even if they expect their candidate to lose. This reasoning moves beyond pure logic and into the realm of civic responsibility. The paradox reveals a deeper issue in democratic systems. It shows how individual incentives do not always align with collective needs. If everyone acted only on the assumption that their single contribution doesn't matter, nothing requiring collective effort would succeed. This applies not just to voting, but to all areas where individual actions contribute to a larger goal. It challenges people to think beyond immediate outcomes and consider how their participation shapes the future. A person pulls a sock from their drawer and notices a small hole near the toe. They hesitate for a moment. Is it still a sock, or has it become something else? The fabric is mostly intact, and the shape remains the same, but the hole changes its function. The sock no longer fully covers the foot. It lets air through where it shouldn't. It might still work for a while, but the wearer will feel the difference. If the hole grows, the sock will stop serving its purpose. At what point does it stop being a sock and become just a piece of fabric? This question might seem trivial, but it raises deeper issues about how people define objects. A sock is meant to cover a foot. When it fails at that task, does it stop being a sock? A hole doesn't instantly erase its identity, but as the hole expands, the sock's function weakens. If the fabric tears apart completely, no one would call it a sock anymore. But what about before that? A small hole is often ignored. A medium hole might make someone hesitate, but still wear it. A large hole forces a choice. The object remains the same in material, yet people no longer treat it the same way. The paradox arises because no single moment marks the transition. If a sock with a hole is still a sock, then a sock with a slightly bigger hole should also be a sock. But by following this reasoning, someone could keep increasing the hole's size while still calling it a sock. Eventually, this leads to something unrecognizable as a sock. At some point, the label must stop applying. But pinpointing that moment is nearly impossible. This problem mirrors the Sorites paradox, also called the paradox of the heap. If a single grain of sand isn't a heap and adding one grain doesn't create a heap, when does a collection of grains become a heap? A person who repairs clothes might see things differently. If they stitch the hole, the sock regains its function. But what if they cut the sock, using the fabric for another purpose? It might become a cleaning rag. At what moment does the identity shift? A sock can be repurposed, yet in the process it ceases to be a sock. This transformation highlights how function and form define objects. If the fabric still covers a foot but has an opening, is it closer to a sock or a leg warmer? If it has multiple holes, does it resemble netting? Identity depends not just on material but on use. Consider a different example. A sweater with a hole in the sleeve is still a sweater. But what if it's missing an entire sleeve? Many would still call it a sweater, though a damaged one. If it lost both sleeves, it might be called a vest instead. This shift happens without any fundamental change to the fabric. Words categorize objects based on their most recognizable features. A sock with a hole is treated as a sock with damage, not a different object. But once damage crosses a certain line, people instinctively switch how they describe it. This paradox extends beyond clothing. A bridge with a missing plank is still a bridge. If more planks disappear, people will still call it a bridge until it becomes too unstable. At some point, they will call it a ruin. That shift doesn't occur because of a single missing plank, but because of a gradual loss of function. A car with a flat tire is still a car. But if it loses all four wheels, an engine, and its seats, it becomes a scrap heap. The transition happens gradually, but the name change happens suddenly. People apply the same logic to everyday objects without realizing it. A chair with a missing leg is still a chair, even if unusable. A phone with a cracked screen remains a phone, though less functional. A book with torn pages is still a book. But when damage crosses a line, the label changes. A pile of torn pages is no longer a book. A shattered phone is electronic waste. The shift in language happens not through strict rules, but through shared perception. People judge objects based on what they expect them to do. Imagine someone buying a sock with a hole in it. If it was advertised as a sock, they would feel misled. But if it was sold as a crafting material, they wouldn't think twice. Context changes how people define things. A sock with a hole at home is still a sock. The same sock in a store might not qualify. People subconsciously consider intention. A sock is meant to be worn, so its definition depends on whether it can still serve that purpose. This reasoning applies to food as well. A loaf of bread missing a slice is still a loaf. A loaf missing half its body might just be a piece of bread. The distinction isn't scientific but practical. The same paradox can be applied to identity. If a person loses a strand of hair, they are the same person. If they lose more hair, nothing changes. But at some point, they might be considered bald. No single moment defines baldness, yet everyone understands when it applies. Age follows the same pattern. There's no exact second when someone transitions from young to old. The change happens slowly, but people categorize based on perception. The same logic applies to names and labels in all aspects of life. This paradox also highlights how objects can remain the same while changing. A sock with a hole remains a sock in some contexts and ceases to be one in others. A repaired sock might be the same sock with a patch, or a new sock made from old fabric. These questions force people to consider how language defines objects. If something functions the same way, it often keeps the same label. If its function changes too much, its name follows. This makes definitions fluid rather than rigid. The paradox of the hole in the sock reveals an everyday problem in how people think about objects. Labels seem clear at first, but break down under closer scrutiny. A sock remains a sock until it doesn't. That moment is difficult to define but easy to recognize when it happens. Whether it's a sock, a car, or a person's own identity, gradual change raises questions about when something stops being what it once was. You are told that you will receive a surprise gift. At first, this seems exciting. The idea of an unexpected present brings anticipation. But then you start thinking about it. If you know you are getting a gift, is it still a surprise? The more you expect it, the less surprising it becomes. Yet, if you try to forget about it, you still know it's coming. This is the paradox of the unexpected gift. Imagine a friend tells you they will surprise you with a gift sometime this week. You don't know the exact day or time, but you do know something is coming. On Monday, you wait, thinking it might happen. Nothing. By Tuesday, you wonder if it will come today. Still nothing. By Wednesday, you try not to expect it, but the thought lingers. If the gift arrives on Friday, was it truly a surprise? You knew it would happen within the week. Even if you didn't know the exact day, you were always waiting for it. This paradox is closely related to the idea of an unexpected exam. A teacher tells the class there will be a surprise test next week. The students start thinking, if the test is on Friday, they will know by Thursday night that it must be on Friday. That means Friday can't be a surprise. The same logic applies to Thursday. By Wednesday night, if it hasn't happened, they would know it must be Thursday. This reasoning continues backward through the week. By this logic, the test can never be a surprise. Yet, when the test happens, the students are still caught off guard. This problem comes from the way expectations work. Surprise means a lack of expectation. If someone tells you that a surprise is coming, they create an expectation. Even if you don't know the exact details, the very fact that you expect something makes it harder for it to be truly unexpected. The paradox happens because of this contradiction. You are given information about something that should be unexpected, which makes it no longer fully unexpected. Consider a birthday party. If someone throws you a surprise party, it should mean you had no idea. But what if you started suspecting it? Maybe your friends are acting differently. Maybe someone slips and hints at it. By the time you walk into the party, you might not be shocked. Does that mean it wasn't a surprise? The paradox appears again. You expected something, but not everything. Maybe you didn't know the exact location or who would be there. So in one sense it wasn't a total surprise, but in another sense, it was. This paradox also applies to storytelling. If a book or movie tells you there will be a twist, you start looking for it. When it happens, you may not know the exact details, but you expected something unexpected. This changes how you experience the story. Some plot twists work because they come from nowhere, while others are satisfying because they were subtly set up. But if you know a twist is coming, your mind scans for clues, making the reveal feel different. The surprise is weakened by anticipation. The same problem happens with magic tricks. A magician tells the audience they will see something amazing. The audience knows a trick is coming. They don't know how it works, but they know to expect deception. The trick can still impress them, but it isn't a true surprise because they were waiting for it. The best magic tricks fool people even when they expect to be fooled. The real shock comes when something happens that even expectation couldn't prepare them for. The paradox of the unexpected gift can also appear in social situations. A person tells their friend, "I'm going to surprise you with something nice." The friend now expects something. The only way to make it a true surprise is to delay it long enough that the friend forgets, or make it happen in a way they never could have predicted. But the moment the friend is told to expect something, the pure element of surprise is lost. This paradox even affects emotions. If you expect to be happy tomorrow because of a specific event, the happiness loses some of its spontaneity. If you expect to be disappointed, the anticipation dulls the impact. This is why unexpected joy can feel more intense than planned happiness. The less you see something coming, the stronger the reaction. In marketing, companies use this paradox when they announce a big reveal. If a company says they have a major surprise for customers, the announcement itself creates expectation. When the reveal happens, people might feel overwhelmed because they had time to imagine something bigger. The paradox plays out as expectation dulls the surprise factor. This is why some brands prefer to launch products without prior hints, allowing the shock factor to stay intact. The paradox also appears in relationships. Someone plans a romantic surprise for their partner. If they drop too many hints, the other person starts expecting it, which reduces the impact. But if they give no hints, the partner might not be prepared to enjoy it fully. The balance between surprise and expectation is difficult to manage. Too much anticipation, and the magic fades. Too little, and the moment might not be appreciated as deeply. The paradox of the unexpected gift highlights a problem in logic and human experience. Expectation changes reality. The more you anticipate something, the less surprising it becomes. If someone tells you that a surprise is coming, they take away part of what makes a surprise work. This tension creates a strange loop. The very act of preparing for the unexpected makes it less unexpected. People experience this paradox in everyday life. A child eagerly waits for a Christmas present. They know they will get something, but they don't know what. When they finally open it, they might still be surprised by the contents, but they were never surprised by the fact that a gift was coming. This is why sudden, unplanned gifts often create stronger reactions. A random act of kindness can feel more impactful than an expected holiday present, because it comes without warning. A practical way to resolve this paradox is to introduce uncertainty. If you want to truly surprise someone, you don't just tell them a surprise is coming. Instead, you keep the timing or nature completely unpredictable. Instead of saying, "I got you something," you might simply wait until the right moment and present it without any build-up. The surprise remains intact because there was no time for expectation to interfere. This paradox shows that our minds struggle with conflicting information. We want to know what to expect, but the moment we do, the event loses some of its spontaneity. The tension between knowing and not knowing shapes how we experience surprises, stories, magic, emotions, and even logic itself. The unexpected gift remains a paradox, because the very act of knowing something is coming makes it less of a surprise, yet the details can still catch us off guard. Imagine a prison with an infinite number of cells, each occupied by a single prisoner. The warden announces that a new prisoner will arrive and must be accommodated. In a normal prison with a finite number of cells, this would be a problem. There would be no room. But in an infinite prison, a simple strategy makes space. The warden orders every prisoner to move from their current cell to the next highest numbered cell. The prisoner in cell 1 moves to cell 2. The prisoner in cell 2 moves to cell 3. The prisoner in cell 3 moves to cell 4, and so on. Because there is no last cell, no one is left without a new place to go. Since cell 1 is now empty, the new prisoner moves in. The paradox emerges from the fact that even though every cell was already occupied, an extra prisoner has been added without removing anyone. At first, this seems impossible. If all cells were occupied before the shift, then there should not have been space to begin with. But in an infinite system, shifting everyone forward still leaves an open spot. The same logic can be extended further. If instead of adding just one new prisoner, the warden wanted to add an infinite number of new prisoners, the static strategy could be modified. Instead of moving everyone just one step up, every prisoner moves to the cell that is twice their current number. The prisoner in cell 1 moves to cell 2, the prisoner in cell 2 moves to cell 4, the prisoner in cell 3 moves to cell 6, the prisoner in cell 4 moves to cell 8, and so on. Now all odd-numbered cells are empty. Since there are infinitely many odd numbers, there is enough room for an infinite number of new prisoners. The paradox challenges intuition because it contradicts how numbers behave in a finite system. In a normal prison with a limited number of cells, if every cell is occupied, there is no way to add a new prisoner without removing someone. The concept of infinity changes this rule. An infinite set can accommodate more elements, even when it is already full. The structure of infinity allows room to be created without needing to remove anything. This paradox is related to Hilbert's hotel, a thought experiment by mathematician David Hilbert. In Hilbert's example, a hotel with infinitely many rooms is completely full. A new guest arrives, and instead of turning them away, the hotel manager moves each guest to the next highest numbered room. Room 1's guest moves to room 2, room 2's guest moves to room 3, room 3's guest moves to room 4, and so on. Room 1 is now available for the new guest, even though the hotel was already full. The same method allows infinitely many new guests to be accommodated by shifting each existing guest to the room that is twice their current number. The key is that infinity is not like a normal number. It follows different rules. The paradox of the infinite jail also connects to set theory and the way mathematicians think about infinite collections. In everyday life, adding one item to a full container makes it overflow. This does not happen with infinite sets. The set of all natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, is infinite. If you add one more number to this set, it is still infinite. If you double every number in the set, it is still infinite. This seems strange because it does not follow the usual logic of counting. The same idea applies to rational numbers. Between any two numbers, there are infinitely many fractions. No matter how many fractions are removed, the set remains infinite. This explains why an infinite jail can always accommodate more prisoners. The number of cells may be infinite, but shifting the prisoners reorganizes the structure rather than limiting its size. Another way to think about this paradox is to compare it to a never-ending line of people. Suppose an infinite line of people is standing in a queue. Each person is assigned a number, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. If a new person arrives and must be placed at the front, everyone shifts forward one step. The person in position 1 moves to position 2, the person in position 2 moves to position 3, the person in position 3 moves to position 4, and so on. The new person now stands at position 1. Even though the line was already infinitely long, it absorbed another person. The number of people did not change in a meaningful way because infinity plus 1 is still infinity. This paradox also has implications for how we understand space and movement. Suppose an infinitely long train has a passenger in every seat. A new passenger arrives and must find a seat. The train conductor tells everyone to move one seat forward. Every passenger finds a new seat, and the first seat is now available. In a finite train, this would not work. Eventually, someone would reach the end. But in an infinite train, no one runs out of space. The train remains as infinite as it was before. Thinking about this paradox from a physical perspective raises additional questions. Could such a jail or hotel exist in reality? In the physical world, every space has limits. Even the universe, though vast, may not be truly infinite. If space were infinite, could it operate under these same mathematical principles? Could an infinite structure hold an infinite number of objects and still make room for more? The paradox is purely mathematical, but it forces a reconsideration of how the concept of full applies to infinite systems. Another variation of the paradox involves time. Imagine a timeline stretching infinitely into the past and future. If every moment is already occupied by an event, can a new event still occur? If time is infinite, does it behave like the infinite jail, where new moments can be inserted without pushing anything out? This question relates to discussions in philosophy and physics about whether the universe had a beginning, or whether time itself is infinite. The paradox also appears in discussions of population growth. If the universe contained an infinite number of civilizations, could a new civilization still emerge? If each civilization occupied a specific location in an infinite universe, shifting all civilizations over by one unit could create space for a new one. This mirrors the logic of the infinite jail. The total number of civilizations remains infinite, but a new one has been added without displacing any others. This idea can also apply to abstract concepts like information storage. If an infinitely large database stores an entry in every available slot, can a new entry still be added? If every entry shifts to a new position, the first slot becomes available. This approach suggests that an infinite database can always expand without ever running out of space. The paradox of the infinite jail does not break any mathematical rules, but it defies normal intuition. People think of full as meaning no more can be added. Infinity does not work that way. This is why the concept of infinity is both useful and strange. It allows for a system that is completely occupied, yet still able to accommodate more. The paradox challenges assumptions about numbers, space, and structure, showing that infinite sets behave in ways that seem impossible at first glance.